Jonah crouched beside the grave, his fingers trembling as they brushed away the dirt from Atlas's collar. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow on the earth where his best friend lay, his protector, his constant, the one soul who had ever understood the weight of his silence. And now, with the world quietly waking around him, Jonah realized that for the first time in years, the silence felt unbearable. There was no comforting thump of Atlas's tail, no steady breath beside him as he slept. Only the emptiness. With a ragged breath, Jonah whispered into the morning air, "How do you let go of the only love you've ever known?" Jonah had always lived alone. The small blacksmith shop nestled on the edge of a sleepy village was more than just a workplace. It was his home, his sanctuary, his world. His days were simple. He worked the forge from dawn till dusk, shaping iron into horseshoes, tools, and nails. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, the crackling flames the only company he needed. He wasn't a man who craved conversation, and the silence of his life had become a comfort, a balm to his soul. Winter had always been his favorite time of year. The snow, fresh and untouched, coated the landscape like a blanket of quiet, muffling. The world. The biting cold was something Jonah welcomed. It was familiar, a constant companion. His small cottage, attached to the blacksmith's shop, was warm and inviting, the hearth always burning with a steady flame. That particular winter night, however, was different. The wind howled fiercely against the windows, rattling the old panes and causing the walls to creak. Jonah could hear the storm outside, but he didn't mind. He was accustomed to such nights. Yet, as he sat by the fire, his hands clasped around a steaming mug of tea, a strange noise broke through the wind. It was soft at first, a muffled whimper that Jonah could barely hear over the sound of the storm. He stood up slowly, his joints aching from a long day's work, and moved toward the door. For a moment he hesitated. It was late, too late to be out in the cold. But something about the sound tugged at his heart, a feeling he couldn't ignore. Opening the door, Jonah was greeted by a gust of icy air that cut through him like a blade. He squinted against the snow, trying to make out what lay in front of him. The night was dark, save for the pale light of the moon reflecting off the snow. And then he saw it, a small, shivering creature huddled near the doorstep, barely visible against the white backdrop of the storm. It was a dog. Jonah's heart lurched. The dog was filthy, its fur matted with ice and snow. It was emaciated, ribs jutting out sharply beneath its coat, and its eyes wide, pleading, desperate, locked onto Jonah's with an intensity that spoke volumes. The dog was hurt, hungry, cold, and it had nowhere to go. "Hey, there," Jonah murmured, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. The dog did not move, but its eyes followed Jonah's every step as he knelt down in front of it. He could see the fear in the dog's gaze, but there was also something else, trust. An unspoken plea, a silent understanding that this man was its last hope. Jonah didn't know why he reached out for the dog or why he was compelled to help. It wasn't as though he had ever been an animal lover. In fact, the quiet of his solitary life suited him just fine. But this dog, this broken creature, called to something deep within him. Without another thought, Jonah scooped the animal into his arms and brought it inside. The warmth of the fire hit them as they stepped into the cottage. Jonah gently placed the dog down near the hearth, taking a moment to assess the poor animal. The dog was trembling violently, its fur caked with snow and ice. Jonah ran a hand through his graying beard, looking around the room. His life was simple, and his resources were limited, but there was always enough to share. He moved to the kitchen, taking a few scraps from the table and a bowl of water. The dog's nose twitched at the scent of food, and with trembling paws it staggered forward, eager to eat. It didn't take much, just a little warmth, a little care. In a few moments, the dog devoured what Jonah had given it, its hunger unrelenting. When it had finished, the dog sat back on its haunches, looking up at Jonah with eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken words. Jonah's heart softened. He'd never been a man who understood the emotional language of animals, but this was different. He could feel the bond forming between them already, as if the dog had always been meant to be here. "Good boy," Jonah muttered, unsure of what else to say. He didn't know much about dogs, but he knew that they often had a way of sensing when someone needed them. This dog, ragged and weary as it was, had sensed him. Jonah stoked the fire, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The dog curled up by the hearth, its body still trembling, but the warmth of the fire seemed to soothe it. Jonah could see that the dog was exhausted, its eyes were heavy, and it let out a low, contented sigh as it rested its head on its paws. Jonah had no intention of keeping the dog. His life was solitary, and he had no desire for the complications that a pet would bring. But something about the dog's presence in the room, a quiet, unobtrusive presence, began to feel like a comfort. The silence that had once been his constant companion now felt different. There was something reassuring about having this creature here, even if it was only for the night. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cottage there was warmth. Jonah sat back down in his chair, watching the dog sleep by the fire. He let his thoughts wander, but his gaze often returned to the creature curled up in front of him. He found himself wondering where the dog had come from, how it had ended up in this storm, and why it had sought him out. It didn't matter. For the first time in a long while, Jonah felt the stirrings of something inside him, something that wasn't loneliness. It was a strange feeling, and he didn't know what to make of it. All he knew was that, in this moment, he wasn't alone. As the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall outside, Jonah leaned back, closed his eyes, and allowed himself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The dog, too, rested, its breathing slow and steady as it dreamt of warmth, safety, and something it had long since lost. When Jonah woke the next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was clear, the sun shining brightly on the freshly fallen snow. The dog was still there, curled up by the fire, but now its eyes were open, watching Jonah with quiet gratitude. Jonah rose from his chair, stretching stiff muscles, and made his way to the door. The world outside was a blanket of white, pristine, and untouched. He paused for a moment, looking back at the dog. There was no need for words. Something had changed between them overnight. He went to the small cupboard and found a cholera. Simple thing, one he had bought years ago in case he ever had a dog. He hadn't thought about it since then, but now it seemed right. With steady hands, Jonah gently fastened the collar around the dog's neck, feeling a strange sense of finality. He wasn't sure what had brought this creature into his life, but he knew one thing for certain: the dog wasn't going anywhere. And so, from that moment on, Jonah and Atlas were no longer strangers. The man and the dog, bound by an unspoken understanding, had found each other in the coldest, loneliest of winters. As the days passed, Jonah's life slowly began to change. The dog Atlas, as Jonah had named him, became an inseparable part of his world. It wasn't that Jonah had planned for this, but it seemed that Atlas had decided for him. The dog's presence, at first an unexpected burden, quickly turned into a quiet source of comfort. Like a warm blanket on a bitter winter's day, the first few weeks were filled with adjustments. Atlas was a large dog, strong and capable, with a coat of rich, rust-colored fur that looked like it belonged in a painter's canvas. He had the kind of frame that suggested a history of running through fields, climbing mountains, and bounding across rivers. Yet despite his size and strength, Atlas carried himself with a gentle grace. Always aware of Jonah's presence, always moving in a way that suggested he was not here by accident, but for a reason. Jonah quickly learned that Atlas was a loyal creature. Every morning, without fail, the dog was there by his side as soon as he rose from bed, his eyes bright and expectant. When Jonah went to the forge, Atlas followed him like a shadow, settling by the hearth in the corner of the shop, while Jonah worked. The rhythmic sound of hammer on metal, the heat of the fire, the scent of iron, it all became a part of Atlas's world, too. The dog would lie on the cold stone floor, eyes half closed, the flickering firelight casting shadows across his face. At first, Jonah had been uncertain about having Atlas so close. The blacksmith shop was small, and the constant companionship felt strange. Yet, over time, Atlas seemed to find a way to fit seamlessly into Jonah's routines. He didn't beg for attention, didn't demand to be fed at inconvenient moments. He simply existed, steady and reliable, like the hum of the forge or the tick of the clock on the wall. Their bond deepened with each passing day. Jonah didn't realize it at first, but he began to speak more often, to himself and to the dog. He'd tell Atlas about the day's work, explain how the hammer felt in his hand, how the heat from the forge radiated through his skin, how the iron responded to the hammer's strike. Of course, Atlas never answered, but the sound of Jonah's voice was enough. There was a comfort in speaking aloud, and for once, Jonah wasn't alone with his thoughts. Atlas, with his calm demeanor and patient eyes, made Jonah feel like someone was listening, even if he knew the dog didn't understand the words. There were mornings when Jonah would wake to the soft sound of claws scraping against the wood floor, and Atlas would be there at his bedside, eyes filled with quiet expectation, tail wagging gently as if to say, "It's time to get up, Jonah." Jonah, no longer irritated by the early hour, would smile and get to his feet, already knowing that the day would unfold in the same steady rhythm as the last. After a while, it wasn't just the forge and the cottage that became part of their shared life, it was the village too. Jonah had never been one to venture far beyond his home, but with Atlas by his side, he found himself taking walks through the village square, the dog trotting beside him with his head held high. The villagers had long since learned to accept Jonah's quiet presence, but when they saw him with Atlas, something seemed to soften in their hearts. The dog was a magnet for attention. Children would rush up to pet him, and even the older folk would pause to offer a scratch behind his ears. Jonah, who had never been one for social interaction, found himself less isolated. The dog, somehow, had broken the barrier of silence. It wasn't that the villagers expected him to speak more, but with Atlas around, they saw him in a new light. They saw him as someone with a companion, someone with a life beyond the forge. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Jonah feel, for the first time in years, as though he belonged. Atlas, for his part, seemed content with his new life. He wasn't a loud dog, and he didn't seek attention the way some animals did. Instead, he simply existed as a steady, grounding presence. He was there when Jonah worked, when Jonah ate, when Jonah slept. In the evenings, after a long day, they would both sit by the fire, the warmth of the flames, the only sound in the room, aside from the occasional crackle of the burning wood. Sometimes Jonah would look down at Atlas and realize that the dog had become more than just a companion. He was a reflection of Jonah's own quiet, steadfast nature. Together, they were like two pieces of the same puzzle. One particularly cold evening, after a long day at the forge, Jonah sat down at the table with a bowl of soup. Atlas was lying at his feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. In that quiet, thoughtful way he had. Jonah, spooning the warm soup into his mouth, paused for a moment and stared into the fire. The flames danced and crackled, casting fleeting shadows across the room. "Funny," Jonah murmured, almost to himself. "I never thought I'd have a dog." Atlas's ears perked up, as though he understood the sentiment. His tail thumped softly against the floor, a simple acknowledgement, but enough to make Jonah chuckle. He had never realized how much he missed that kind of simple, uncomplicated companionship. "You're a good one, Atlas," Jonah said softly, smiling. At the dog, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Atlas didn't respond, of course, but there was a certain warmth in his eyes, a shared understanding between them. Jonah realized then that this bond, this companionship, wasn't about words or grand gestures. It was about presence, about being there for one another, day after day, in silence, in peace. The seasons changed, as they always did, and with each passing day, Jonah and Atlas grew older together. The cold, dark months of winter eventually gave way to the warm, fragrant spring, and then the heat of summer, followed by the mellow days of autumn. But through it all, the steady presence of the dog remained. No matter the season, no matter the weather, Atlas was there. The days might have passed quietly, but Jonah knew that the world had changed in subtle ways. The rhythm of his life, once solitary and unchanged, now had an added layer of comfort. Atlas was a constant. His eyes, his fur, the steady rhythm of his breathing, all were reminders that life, even in its simplest form, was a shared experience. Jonah had never believed in fate, but he couldn't deny that there was something almost miraculous about the way Atlas had arrived at his doorstep that stormy night. And now, as the two of them moved through life together, It seemed that the dog had brought with him not just warmth from the fire, but a warmth in Jonah's heart that had been long dormant. Summer had arrived in the village, its warmth spreading across the land like a slow-moving tide. The once snow-covered hills were now dotted with green, and the air, thick with the scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers, seemed to hum with life. The days grew longer, stretching lazily into evening, and Jonah found himself working more. Hours at the forge, his muscles aching but his heart lighter than it had been in years. Atlas, as always, was by his side. The dog had grown strong over the months, his once thin body now muscular and solid, his coat gleaming in the sunlight like a polished chestnut. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Atlas would rise from his bed beside the fire and stretch, yawning deeply before trotting to Jonah's side. Their daily routine had become so natural, so comfortable, that Jonah sometimes forgot just how much his life had changed since the dog had arrived. The village, too, had changed its rhythm with the seasons. People were more willing to leave their homes now, walking the dusty paths to visit friends or shop at the market. Jonah would often find himself walking beside Atlas in the early mornings, the dog's head held high as they passed through the village square, his tail wagging in slow, steady beats. There was no longer a sense of isolation, no feeling of being an outsider. The villagers nodded to him with respect, even a smile or two exchanged now and then. Atlas had done what no other creature had ever been able to do. He had bridged the gap between Jonah and the world, but something was different now. It was subtle at first, a quiet unease that crept into Jonah's bones like a chill wind. Atlas, ever the loyal companion, had always been the one to lead, the one to guide. His steps were sure, his gaze steady, but in recent days the dog had been behaving oddly. Jonah first noticed it during a late afternoon walk. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. As usual, Atlas was walking beside him, though his usual confidence seemed diminished. The dog's pace had slowed, and his eyes, those steady, loyal eyes, were now filled with an unspoken wariness. He would stop suddenly, his nose twitching, his ears pricked, as if listening for something Jonah could not hear. Jonah paused, his heart thudding in his chest. The forest at the edge of the village was quiet, too quiet. No birds chirped, no breeze stirred the leaves. Only the soft rustle of the trees seemed to break the silence. Atlas stood motionless beside him, his body tense, eyes locked on the horizon, as though sensing something Jonah couldn't see. "Atlas?" Jonah whispered, kneeling to look into the dog's face. But Atlas didn't answer. He merely stared into the distance, his body low to the ground, the muscles in his back coiled like a spring ready to snap. Jonah's unease grew. The dog had always been a sentinel, aware of his surroundings, but this was different. Atlas seemed to be guarding something Jonah couldn't see. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of waiting. "Come on, boy," Jonah said softly, trying to shake the feeling off. "It's just the evening air." But Atlas remained still, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on the distant trees. Jonah tried to coax him to move, but the dog refused, as though some invisible force held him in place. The silence stretched on, and Jonah's heart quickened. Something was wrong. With a final glance at the trees, Atlas gave a low, growly sound Jonah had never heard from him before. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Jonah felt the hair on his arm stand up as he turned to leave. Without a word, Atlas followed, but the unease lingered. A feeling that refused to be shaken. That night, Jonah couldn't sleep. The feeling from the walk, the eerie quiet, the tension in Atlas's movements, kept playing in his mind. He tossed and turned in bed, staring at the shadows cast by the flickering firelight. It was then that he realized the weight of it all, the strange feeling of being watched, the tightness in his chest, the low growl that hadn't quite felt like a warning, but more like an urgent plea. The next morning, Jonah rose earlier than usual, hoping the fresh day would bring a sense of calm. But as soon as he stepped outside, the oppressive silence returned. The village was still, too still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Atlas stood by the door, his gaze locked on the horizon, his tail tucked low behind him. Jonah bent down to scratch the dog behind the ears, but Atlas didn't respond. His eyes were distant, alert, his posture rigid. It was then that Jonah noticed a slight limp in Atlas's step. The dog wasn't moving with his usual fluid grace. Instead, each step was deliberate, cautious, as if the weight of the world had suddenly settled on his broad shoulders. Jonah's stomach clenched. Something was terribly wrong, and he had no idea what it was. For the rest of the day, Atlas remained by Jonah's side, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Even as Jonah worked at the forge, Atlas sat in the corner, his eyes scanning the yard, his ears twitching at every sound. The dog's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by a quiet vigilance, as though he were expecting something. Or someone. That evening, as Jonah closed up the shop and began his walk back to the cottage, he could feel the weight of the air, thick with something he couldn't quite name. Atlas was walking a few paces ahead of him, his eyes darting back and forth. His tail low. Suddenly, Atlas stopped in his tracks, his hackles raised. He let out a sharp bark, startling Jonah. The dog stood frozen, eyes locked on something Jonah could not see, ears flat against his skull. For a long moment there was silence. Then from the edge of the forest came a distant sound, a low, guttural growl, deep and menacing. Jonah's blood ran cold. The sound was unmistakable. There was something in the forest, something that Atlas had sensed before he had. The dog's growl had been a warning, but it was also a plea, as if Atlas was asking Jonah to listen. "What is it, Atlas?" Jonah asked, though he already knew the answer. Whatever it was, whatever Atlas had been guarding against, was closer now. And the dog was no longer the calm, steady companion Jonah had known for so long. Atlas was afraid. Jonah moved closer to the dog, placing a hand on his back. Atlas didn't flinch, but he didn't take his eyes off the forest. "I don't know what's out there," Jonah murmured, his voice tight. "But we'll face it together." The growl echoed again, louder this time, closer. Jonah took a deep breath. Whatever it was coming, and it was coming fast. Atlas's posture was rigid, his teeth bared. And Jonah knew whatever this was, it was a threat. The night was no longer still. It was heavy with danger. The evening sky, once soft with the colors of dusk, had darkened into a deep indigo, and the chill in the air carried with it a sense of foreboding. Jonah stood at the edge of his cottage, his heart thudding against his ribs, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Beside him, Atlas remained unmoving, his body taut with tension. The growl had echoed again, closer this time, the sound unmistakably predatory, a low rumble that chilled Jonah to his core. There was something in the forest. Jonah swallowed hard. He had lived in this village all his life, had walked the paths through the woods countless times, yet never had he felt such a sense of dread. The trees, normally so welcoming, seemed to loom now like sentinels, watching and waiting. The wind whispered through the branches, but it wasn't the usual rustling this time. It felt like something else, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. "Stay close, boy," Jonah murmured, more to reassure himself than Atlas. The dog, with his keen instincts, had already known the danger was coming long before Jonah had felt it. Now Atlas was alert, his eyes scanning the shadowed underbrush, ears flicking at every sound, every movement. Jonah's hand hovered over the small knife he kept strapped to his belt. It wasn't much, just a simple tool for carving wood, not a weapon in any sense, but in his grip it felt like the only thing between him and whatever was out there. His pulse quickened as the growl sounded once more, echoing from the depths of the trees. Without a word, Atlas began moving forward, his steps slow but purposeful, his body low to the ground. Jonah followed, hesitant but unwilling to let the dog face whatever lay ahead alone. His mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. Wolves? A bear, perhaps? The village was small, its people few, and there had been whispers of strange sightings in the forest, but no one had ever taken them seriously. They were just old stories until now. The further they walked, the heavier the air became. Jonah's breath came in quick bursts, visible in the cold night. Atlas led the way, his tail tucked low and his head slightly down as if he were searching for something just beyond sight. His nose twitched, nostrils flaring as he picked up the scent of the unknown. Jonah's eyes scanned the forest, his feet crunching softly on the dry leaves and twigs beneath him. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, a vast ocean of blackness that swallowed up any light from the moon. The shadows between the trees danced, playing tricks on Jonah's mind, making him second-guess every sound, every movement. Then, suddenly, Atlas stopped. Jonah's heart leapt into his throat as the dog froze, his body rigid and his gaze locked on something ahead. The growl, deep and guttural, came again, but this time it was accompanied by another sound of rustling, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. The wind picked up again, sending a shiver down Jonah's spine. His pulse raced, and every instinct in his body told him to turn back, to retreat to the safety of his cottage, to the warmth of the fire. But Atlas wasn't moving. And Jonah knew, deep down, that there was no turning back now. He reached out a hand to the dog, placing a gentle but firm grip on his collar. Atlas's body quivered with tension, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted slightly, nudging Jonah's hand as if asking for reassurance. Jonah didn't have any reassurance to offer. He could feel it now, the presence. The air had shifted, and the silence around them was no longer natural. It was as if the world itself had drawn a deep breath, holding it, waiting, and then, from the shadows between the trees, it emerged. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. He could make out the figure of something too large to be a deer, too low to the ground to be a bear. Its body was hunched, its fur dark and matted with dirt and leaves. Its eyes gleamed like twin embers in the darkness, reflecting the faint light of the moon. Jonah froze. The creature's presence was oppressive, its very being suffocating the space around them. Atlas growled, low and warning, his body trembling with the effort of holding back. Jonah's mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his legs refused. To obey, the creature took a step forward, its claws scraping against the earth. It was neither a wolf nor a bear, but something else, something darker, more unnatural. Its snout was elongated, its teeth sharp and yellowed, visible even from the distance. Jonah's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a drum of terror. It was the growl that finally shook Jonah from his paralysis. It wasn't just a growl anymore. It was a snarl, a sound that filled the night with a sense of raw hunger. The creature was hungry, and it had been hunting. Atlas leapt forward suddenly, a blur of muscle and fury. He was no longer the calm, watchful companion. He was a warrior, driven by instinct, by the desire to protect. The creature responded in kind, a snarl of fury escaping its throat as it lunged at Atlas, its massive jaws snapping. The two collided, with a force that shook the ground, Atlas's growl mingling with the creature's. Jonah stood frozen, watching the battle unfold before him. The dog and the creature were a whirlwind of fur and claws, locked in a deadly dance. The speed and ferocity of the fight were beyond anything Jonah had ever witnessed. And he knew that Atlas, strong as he was not invincible. The dog was a guardian, a protector, but he was also a living being, vulnerable like all creatures. Jonah's thoughts broke through the panic. I need to help him, but how? His heart raced and his breath came in quick, shallow gasps. His hand went to his belt again, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around the small knife. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Without thinking, Jonah rushed forward, his body moving on pure instinct. He knew Atlas was in danger. He knew this fight was not one the dog could win alone, with every ounce of strength in his body. Jonah hurled himself toward the creature, screaming as loud as he could, hoping to distract it long enough for Atlas to gain the upper hand. But the creature was fast, its eyes swiveling toward him in a blink. It snarled, its gaze filled with an inhuman intelligence that sent chills down Jonah's spine. Atlas, seeing his chance, launched himself at the creature's flank, sinking his teeth into its side. The creature howled in pain, but its focus remained on Jonah, eyes narrowing with deadly intent. Jonah's blood ran cold as the creature turned its gaze back toward him. He could see the intent in its eyes. There was no mercy, no hesitation. The creature was ready to finish what it had started. And then, in a flash of motion, Atlas was there. He lunged forward, sinking his jaws into the creature's throat with a powerful snap. The creature screamed in rage, but it was too late. Atlas's strength and speed overpowered the creature, and with a final, desperate yelp, it collapsed to the ground. Its body going limp. Atlas stood over the fallen creature, panting heavily, his fur slick with blood. He was wounded. There were cuts and gashes along his sides, and his breath came in shallow gasps, but he was alive. The battle had been won, but at a cost. Jonah's knees buckled beneath him as he collapsed to the ground. His heart still racing in his chest. He was alive. They were alive. But at what cost? What had they just fought, and what other dangers lay hidden in the dark corners of the world? Jonah sat motionless, his back pressed against the cold stone wall of his cottage. The fire crackled quietly in front of him, the warm glow of its flames contrasting sharply with the emptiness inside him. Atlas's body lay stretched out beside him, a peaceful stillness now settling over the dog's form. But to Jonah, the silence was deafening. It pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Atlas's absence was a physical ache, a hollow space that had once been filled with the dog's quiet presence, his unwavering loyalty. The night had passed in a blur. Jonah had kept vigil over the dog's body, unable to bring himself to bury him, to let go. The weight of the loss was too much to bear. He had thought he'd prepared for this moment. He had imagined it countless times in the quiet corners of his mind, what it would be like when the time came to say goodbye. But no amount of imagining could have prepared him for the reality of it. The world outside had begun to shift with the first light of dawn. The morning sun stretched lazily across the sky, casting a soft golden hue on the landscape. Birds had begun to sing, the world waking up to another day. But for Jonah, everything felt muffled, as though the life he had known had suddenly been muted. Stripped of its color and sound, he looked down at Atlas, his breath catching in his throat as the memory of the fight, of the creature, of Atlas's last moments filled his mind. The dog had been so strong, so fearless, right up until the end. The image of Atlas standing between him and the world, fighting for him even when he was already so close to the edge, made Jonah's heart ache with a love so deep it hurt. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts. He couldn't believe Atlas was gone. He couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that the dog who had been his constant companion, his only true friend for so long, was no longer there. But there was no denying it. Atlas was gone, and Jonah was alone. The thought settled heavily in his chest, like a stone sinking deeper and deeper with each breath. He felt a loss so profound that it seemed to drain the color from the room. The cottage, which had once felt so full with Atlas's presence, now seemed unbearably small. Empty. The door creaked open softly, and Jonah looked up to see a familiar figure standing in the doorway, Myra, the village healer. She had been one of the few people who had ever looked past Jonah's rough exterior, who had offered him a kind word when the rest of the village had avoided him. Her expression softened as she saw the state Jonah was in. Without a word, she walked over and sat down beside him, her eyes flicking to Atlas's still form. The sorrow in her eyes was unmistakable, but it was also mixed with something else, an understanding. Jonah didn't look at her. He couldn't bring himself to. Instead, he focused on the fire, on the dancing flames that seemed so alive and yet so distant, as if they belonged to another world. "I'm sorry, Jonah," Myra said quietly, her voice gentle, like the wind. "Through the trees. I heard what happened. I know how much he meant to you." Jonah swallowed hard, his throat tight. He didn't answer. What was there to say? Words felt useless now, pointless. What good were words when the thing that had held him together for so long was gone? "I don't know what to do," Jonah muttered finally, his voice raw. "He's gone, and I don't know how to live without him." Myra said nothing for a moment, her gaze lingering on Atlas's body. Then she reached over, placing a hand gently on Jonah's arm. Her touch was warm, solid, offering something he couldn't put into words. "You've been through so much, Jonah," she said softly, "and I know you loved him more than anything. But you don't have to do this alone." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. What's the point of anyone being here now? Atlas was the only thing that ever made me feel like I belonged anywhere. Without him, dot dot dot. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The pain was too much. Myra gave a small, understanding nod. I know it feels like the world is crumbling beneath you, but grief is a strange thing. It comes in waves, and sometimes all you can do is let it wash over you. And when the wave recedes, there's still something left. Something you'll carry with you. Jonah looked at her then, his eyes red and swollen from the tears he hadn't even realized he'd shed. Myra was right in a way. There was something in him, a spark of life, a memory, that he had to hold on to. But right now, it felt so far out of reach. I don't know how to carry it, Jonah whispered, his voice breaking. It feels like I'm carrying too much. Myra took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as though she were trying to find the right words to offer him comfort. You're not carrying it alone? You'll never carry it alone? There are people who care for you, Jonah. You've had that love from Atlas, and you'll carry it in your heart. And in time, you'll find that it makes you stronger. Even when it feels like it's breaking you, it will shape you into someone. Someone who can honor that love. Jonah looked at her, her calm presence a balm to the storm inside him. The storm wasn't over. It wouldn't be for a long time. But maybe, just maybe, Myra was right. Maybe there was still something to carry forward, even if it was just the memory of the dog who had once been his world. After a long pause, Jonah stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. He glanced at Atlas's still form one last time, his heart tight with grief. He didn't want to leave the dog behind, but he knew what he had to do. We have to bury him, Jonah said quietly. His voice was firm now, as though he had finally made peace with something. He needed to do this for both of them. Myra nodded, standing beside him. I'll help you, together. And so they went outside, the soft light of dawn just beginning to spill over the land. Jonah dug the grave at the foot of the old oak tree. The same tree where he had once played as a child, a place he had always found solace. He worked quietly. His mind focused on the task at hand, the rhythmic motion of the shovel grounding him in the moment. When the hole was ready, Jonah gently lifted Atlas's body, his heart aching with each movement. He laid the dog to rest beneath the tree, the earth closing around him in a quiet, final embrace. As Jonah stood there, staring down at the grave, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, just a little. It wasn't gone, but the burden was lighter. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. In his heart, he whispered the words he had never said aloud. Thank you, Atlas. You gave me everything. The wind whispered through the trees, and for the first time since that night in the forest, Jonah felt a small flicker of peace, a whisper of something that was still there. Something that could never truly be lost. And with that, he stood up, straightening his shoulders, and turned back toward the cottage. He wasn't alone anymore. As Jonah stood there, his heart raw and exposed beneath the morning sun, he couldn't help but ask himself and the world around him, question that echoed in the silence. How do you move on when the love you had was all that ever kept you whole? The breeze whispered through the trees as if to answer, but Jonah couldn't hear it over the pounding in his chest. Now, I leave it to you, the ones who have walked with him through these pages, through grief and through love, through loss. And through hope, can we ever truly heal from the ones we lose? Or do they, like Atlas, remain with us in the quiet moments, in the spaces between heartbeats, forever echoing in our minds? The story of Jonah and Atlas might be ending, but the journey? That's something we all carry with us. So I ask you, what do you carry with you, even after everything is gone? Take a moment. Reflect. What does your heart whisper in the silence? Thank you for walking alongside them. And remember, some stories, no matter how hard, are meant to be shared.